Hey, welcome to Economic Analysis. This video will cover economic models. The study of economics involves the study of models. The models that I'm referring to are simply versions of reality. They're often abstract representations of reality. Some of the best known and most valuable models arose outside of the field of economics. For example, if we go back several centuries, Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo developed models of planetary motion. They used the model to explain and predict planetary motion measured in millions of miles with just observation, pencil, or maybe a quill, and an 8 by 11 piece of paper. Each contributed to the model in their own way and improved it. Newton extended it and invented calculus along the way, a type of math that quantified the results and provided even more precise predictions. Then Einstein took Newton's work and generalized it even further. The planetary model can be scaled down, if you will, to a moving object like a baseball flying through the air with some rather strong assumptions such as the absence of air friction, wind, humidity, etc. And using just paper and pencil, a mathematical model can roughly predict where the ball will land and after it's been hit with a certain force and a certain angle. Once we understand the simple model, we can relax or change the assumptions and make even more precise predictions. The same progress occurs in economics. We start out with simplifying assumptions and develop a model that can make predictions. We test the model, we relax assumptions here and there, and see if we can better understand the phenomena we're trying to explain. In economics, our models will involve diagrams, graphs, and mathematics to systematically explain markets, prices, human behavior, employment, unemployment, inflation, and even productivity itself. One of the first models usually presented in an introductory economics course is the circular flow diagram. Okay, I would like to start out discussing the circular flow diagram with marker and paper. It's probably the best way to represent it. Now, the circular flow diagram is a schematic representation of the organization of the economy. It's a very simple representation. We're going to start out, we're going to have two entities. One is going to be households, and then we're going to have firms. And households are going to buy and consume goods. It's technically goods and services. I'll just say goods to keep it simple. So households will buy goods and services, and firms will produce and sell goods and services. Okay, but now let's see here. Firms, they're going to need inputs in order to do that. So where do the inputs come for the firms to make its production? Well, it turns out that households, we're going to assume that households own and sell what are called factors of production. Okay? And then firms are going to hire and use factors of production. Okay, so now where do they get that? How does this come about? Well, we're going to the firms and the households are going to meet up in a market, and the market is called the market for factors. And when I say factors, let's get into this a little bit more. These are factors used in production. And a factor, examples of factor are land, labor, and capital. Capital meaning equipment, and basically equipment. Right? And so these firms own or assume to own land, labor, and capital, and they supply that to this market, which ultimately these factors go into firms. Okay? So the price at which land, labor, and capital is determined, the price is determined based on supply and demand, firms demand, households supply, these various factors. Now, these factors are inputs into the production process. As you can see, land, labor, and capital. Labor is basically workers, capital is machinery. That's inputs. These are inputs. The reason why they're called factors is because they're not used up in a production process. So if you look at an example of Starbucks, coffee beans are an input that gets used up. Every cup of coffee uses coffee beans, and you throw the leftover coffee beans away. But when you use land, you know, the store is still on the same property, cup after cup after cup that it produces. Each worker produces cup after cup after cup, and the same machinery is working cup after cup after cup. So land, labor, and capital are factors that don't get used up in the production process. Households own them. They basically sell them to firms. And how do these two entities meet up with these in this factor market? For factors, they meet up in a market, which is really where most transactions somehow, some way take place in a market. Okay? So now what we're looking at, we need to figure out, like, well, how do goods get from firms to households which demand them? Well, what we're going to do here is we're going to have a market for goods. And that market for goods is where firms are going to sell their goods and households are going to demand it. So you can see the goods are going from firms. Okay, so this is goods. And then goods are going into the households for consumption. The price of those goods is determined by what firms supply and how much demand is coming from households. And we have a lot to say about the market for goods. It's most of the first half of the course is around that. We have a separate chapter on the market for factors. We will talk about firms and what's called industry structure for about 4 chapters. And we will, throughout the course, talk about households and their demand. Okay, so now we have a simple representation of the economy, but it's nothing but the movement of goods and factors around. What we need to consider is that there's money being spent, and it's going in the opposite direction of these arrows. Because whenever you have a transaction, I'll put it over to the side here, money goes in one direction, and the goods go in the other direction. So what I mean by that is, look, when you buy something, you're giving up money and you're receiving the good, right? Or vice versa when you sell something. So there's goods moving hands, like an item, and then there's money. So what we need to do is show that going on here. So now we got to start somewhere in the circle. Let's just start at the factor market. These factors are sold, and households end up getting income for the sale of their factors. So you're a household, you're a worker, and you go to the labor market. You're basically in the labor market, and you're collecting a wage. That's your income. And now that income can be used for households to buy goods and services. So their spending happens here. Okay? And then that money represents revenue to firms. And then that money for revenue, some of that money is used to buy the factors. So we have factors, we have wages and rent that are used that are paid to essentially go to households, because households, you know, you can see that it's pretty obvious, I think, that they own that there's labor in a household, but they also own the factors of production, meaning land and capital, and so the rent ends up going as income to a household. So there you have it. There you have a representation. And by the way, I tried to put the money movement transactions side of things in green. As you can see the green pen, but sometimes it's kind of hard to show up on paper. And one other thing that we need to take into consideration is, what did we leave out of this diagram? Well, obviously it's a simplification of things. We left out the banking system and financing of things. The banking system never showed up in this discussion. That would complicate things dramatically. We left out the government in this process. That would add a bit of complication, because then you'd have, for example, you'd have taxes that had to be collected, and then transfer payments going to individuals like retired people through Social Security. That's not in here. And then what we've left out is we left out the foreign sector. This is basically a closed economy. And so when you open it up to trade, you now have imports and you have exports. And so firms are dealing with businesses outside of the country. Households are possibly supplying their labor to other countries. Markets for goods can happen in other countries. Factor markets can then happen in other countries, or at least international markets. So things become more complicated. But what you see here is a simplification of it, and you see that basically with every transaction, there's money coming in or out, and there's goods moving back and forth. So, some questions for thought. Nearly all businesses have inventory to meet uncertain demand. In the circular flow diagram just presented, where did we capture inventory? Where was that captured? And similarly, where did we capture investment in capital, which is machinery? It turns out that the answers are related to each other. Inventory was not modeled as we assumed production equaled consumption. In other words, what was produced in one period, whatever period of time we were looking at, is consumed. So there was no inventory. Inventory represents an investment in goods and raw materials, and capital is also an investment, and that wasn't modeled either. So the two are connected. They're both investments that firms make. Okay? Investment in inventory and capital, this is the interesting part, requires savings. We excluded banks and financial markets from the diagram. Okay? So a bank, what's a bank do? It takes money from savers and ends up lending it to banks or to firms that borrow. And what are they borrowing that money for? They're borrowing it to buy capital, equipment, machinery, or inventory. So businesses do borrow for inventory purposes, especially on a seasonal basis. Okay, so those two, one is the two things I was just talking about. Banks and financial markets channel savings from households with excess funds to businesses that borrow for investment purposes. And that's how the two related. They're not included in the model. It would make it a lot more complicated. I guess banks by themselves wouldn't be too complicated. We could add financial markets in there and embellish it a bit more. But the model as it stands is relatively simple, and it gets the points that we really want to get across later on in this course. And that's the important part. We will look at financial aspects of the economy a bit, and it shows up much later in the course when we cover macroeconomics. But in any case, what we captured in the model, the circular flow diagram, covers just what we need for material coming up in the course.